Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored today to have in person the one, the only Dr. Scott Jensen, one of my idols. I'm honored and privileged to interview him previously, but that was remotely, and this is obviously a little bit less. We're in Salt Lake City right now, and Dr. Jensen is a courageous man. He ran for governor against Tim Walz in 2022. You might have heard he came in second, as it were. We're hoping that he comes in a little bit higher on the next round because 2022 plus 4 is going to be 2026. I believe you're running then. Dr. Jensen.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bach, for having me on. It's good to be with you. Yes, I am running for governor in Minnesota in 2026. I think that not just Minnesotans, but I think across the nation and arguably across the planet, over the last 5-6 years, I think we've all endured some hard times. We've felt the heartbreak of watching people's lives turned upside down. And I think at some very basic level, we grasp the fact that our policymakers weren't up to the task, that the people who we might have expected to help stop some of the madness didn't stop the madness. Quite honestly, I think, Dr. Bach, that some of the most insightful analysis of what we were going through at the time we were going through it came from everyday folks who might have a background in engineering or driving truck or teaching kids. I don't think we could really rely on, quote, the PhDs and the medical community. And that, to me, represents a tremendous loss of trust in public health. And that's one of our big challenges going forward.
Absolutely. It's Michael Knowles, who's not a physician, points out the kind of the Latin root of public health is with the people, the publius. And it's the same root word as politics and, frankly, the police. And, the personal aspect of all those things, the polity, the fact that we have Minneapolis, the metropolitan, all that word is that poly part, political science. It's the root of all those things. Yeah. And you are in the Minneapolis area, at least, I imagine. And, I think the polity has been inverted. You can't have civilization without civility. You can't have the polity, the metropolitan area, the metropolises of our nation without the social contract. And I think a lot of that was broken. And I think you are a resolute man, and you not only follow the Hippocratic Oath, but I think you follow one that's similar societally. Maybe you could tell us how that plays out.
That's a really good point. I think the concept of a social contract might vary from person to person, but there might be broad agreement on elements of it. Perhaps that if you've been given in society a position where your voice is relied upon, perhaps more than the average or whatever, and you abuse it, you have violated the social contract. I think that for the everyday person, if they were to go off the rails and say, I'm not going to engage and participate and do my job as a citizen, I'm just going to rant and rave, arguably they've violated the social contract. And I think we can argue about that potentially for years. But more importantly, I think if we want to heal, not just Minnesota and not just the United States, but if we want to heal the human race after what we've gone through, I think we need to recognize the social contract exists across all nations' borders, truthfulness, trust, and, if you will, genuine authenticity and intention has to be a part of that. If we do that, I think we can help heal. And I think at some level, the first step of healing has got to be about hope. I think without hope, I don't have many patients that heal. With hope, I've seen patients miraculously heal when we thought that I might be giving a eulogy at their funeral in a year. So I think the social contract has been abused. We need to prop it back up. We need to remind everybody that they play a role. It might be hard to define the role. And I think just because it's hard to define the role doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to say, how does that apply to my life every day?
Well, those are interesting concepts. And so if we can kind of get from the esoteric to the day-to-day, the mundane, how do we play out? What are the kind of policies that are being enacted in Minnesota? We'll stay there, that are not helping the kind of the social aspect, not socialism, but the social aspect of people's lives. I think socialism, kind of is a nice sounding word. We all like to be social, but I think these things are kind of false labels oftentimes. So kind of bring us, kind of from the bird's eye view down to ground level. What do we do?
3 phrases jump out at me. The first one doesn't answer your question, but the phrase of health freedom jumps out at me right away. But the other 2 phrases that jump out at me that are applicable and usable tools to make certain that we're moving in the right direction would be standard of care and informed consent. Now, the standard of care is oftentimes not necessarily related to the everyday conversation, but it is indeed a real thing in the world of medicine. If there's a somewhat of a tacitly agreed upon standard of care and you violate it as a physician, there needs to be a reason for it. And the standard of care is oftentimes used in the court of law when a physician might be called on in regards to, have you committed malpractice? But the standard of care is not going to become the everyday tool that helps us move past this. Informed consent is the tool. Informed consent is what bubbled up out of the Nuremberg trial and the Nuremberg Code. Informed consent is obviously 2 words, and they are each very powerful in their own right. First, has to be information. Second, has to be consent. That consent has to be voluntary. Otherwise, it's not consent. I think that's the tool that we need to bring things back. And that's the tool that's been most violated. When we went through this last 5 or 6 years and saw executive orders used to squash children's education, close down people's businesses, prevent families from being able to pay the bills, cause elderly, frail people to die horrific, lonely deaths without the solace of their family. Informed consent could have stopped that. Because if you actually looked at what was happening, we didn't need to go in those directions. We were literally seeing policymakers throw mud on the wall to see what would stick. Mm-hmm. And what stuck 5 years later is, quite frankly, an awful lot of falsehoods. At one time, perhaps they were thought to be true, but too slowly they were discovered to not be true. But even more importantly than that is they should never have been allowed to close out the conversation. The lack of paying attention to informed consent, I think, directly gave rise to what would be considered an accepted narrative. And if you didn't go along with the accepted narrative, you were in problems. If you were a contrarian and you said, I hear what you're saying, but I don't agree with you. I mean, that's how I got into this whole mix, if you will. I simply raised my hand and said, you're asking me to change the way I have completed death certificates. I have been doing this for more than 30 years, and now willy-nilly, I get a document from the Minnesota Public Health Department and the CDC, and I'm told that I'm supposed to put down a certain disease as the cause of death, even if I believe it was a different cause of death. And I said, that makes no sense. We don't need to go into the details on that, I don't think. But what happened there was when we were forced to do that as physicians or get in trouble, informed consent was kicked out the door because all of a sudden we were not going to be sharing with our patients the information they needed to truly have informed consent.
Yeah. I think you're making some interesting points there. The essence of the word informed is obviously information. And so, if you control the news and you control the news cycle, we think of if you have a lot of people, I'm noticing a lot of our young people may not have a historic sense about this kind of thing, but, I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union, and information was a commodity that's controlled by the state. And, it's like, little drops that are meted out in certain ways. And if you mishandle it or have a different type of formula for that, then you are punished. And so the actual concept of political correctness, we always hear, this is not politically correct, but the actual concept of political correctness came from the Stalin era, where you could be correct scientifically. You could say, if I drop this pen, it's going to go down every time. That's scientifically correct. But for some reason, Stalin thinks that day that pens should go up, You could be scientifically correct, but you wouldn't be politically correct. And that would put you in the gulag, put you in a kangaroo court. And so being correct physically, socially, whatever, is not enough if you're not politically correct. And I think what happened, a lot of perversions you're talking about in the medical scientific world, was through this constraint of information and what was allowed to be out. So you were penalized, and penalized, the same word as penal colony, it means punishment. You were penalized for saying the right things at the right time. And now you're a man of integrity, and you stood up for it. I'm curious, I'm going to do one more sideline. I apologize, but President Obama just the other day was on an interview thing, and he's talking about this concept of information. What is the news? And the news is going to have some governmental framework for what is allowed. Otherwise, there's going to be misinformation in his definition. Now, anybody can define misinformation as the stuff I don't like. And so I'm just wondering, how we bring this back into the kind of the general concept for, Minneapolis, Minnesota voters and so forth, and how, what's the kind of things you're going to present? What are the things you are in contradistinction to Tim Walz on these concepts? How does this play out, again, for, say, more man on the street aspects, understanding that we went through an episode where we saw some kind of a Sovietization of the channeling of information. How do we keep debate? How do we keep conversation? How do we keep open societies open? And how do we work on the civility and the polity parts of our, political conversation?
That's a great question. And there's a lot in that. There's a lot to unpack. I think it was Reagan that made a comment something like this. He said, the government's role appropriately is to protect the people from government. But when government chooses to start trying to protect people from people, it's overstepped its bounds. In other words, the First Amendment, which obviously protects freedom of speech as well as other things, that First Amendment has to stand in my own heart of hearts to protect the language that someone else might utter that I think may be a lie. In other words, I don't get to tell the other individual what they get to say or not. We have a society of laws, so that if you're saying false things and you know they're false and you say them to hurt someone, you can be in a court of law civilly in regards to slander and things like that. But the bottom line is, freedom of speech isn't freedom of speech unless you get your freedom and I get my freedom. And if we have opposite perspectives on something, one of us may well be wrong and the other one might be right, or maybe they're both wrong, but it doesn't really matter. Freedom of speech means freedom of speech. And that's why I think Reagan said government oversteps its bounds when it decides to try to protect people from people within our own country. And that's a hard concept, because I think what we've lived through over the last 5-6 years, we've got, especially legacy media, all the time saying, well, this was debunked, or this was not true, or this was not scientifically based, but this was scientifically based. I mean, I just think of the arguments that we had in regards to the last 5 or 6 years in regards to where the origin of it was. And that was a big deal. And if you said the wrong words, you were in social media jail, things like that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And yes, there is kind of, in China, another communist polity, this concept of the social, what do they call it? Social credit. So they have social credit scores and whatnot. And if you say something on social media, you may not be able to get on a train, or you may not be able to get on an express bus. You got to take, some whatever, pedaling on a bicycle, whatever. They don't put you in prison per se, but it's a gradation. So, you wind up kind of the Rosa Parks example. You wind up in the back of the bus, and it's kind of a segregation, not on color, because they don't have that distinction there, but on thought. But as say things are playing out there's some interesting kind of political items in Minneapolis, I don't know about St. Paul, whatever, in Minnesota, writ large. There's a mayoral election. I don't know how you see things playing out in Minneapolis. I mean, right now, you and I happen to be at a conference and in Salt Lake City. I don't know how the sizes of the towns compare.
250,000 people in Salt Lake City, roughly, and about 500,000 people in Minneapolis.
So do you have any thoughts about how things are, how a governor can influence the day-to-day lives of people in your state and cities?
Well, from a governor's role, and that election is 12 months away, I think the governor clearly has a tremendous amount of power just through executive orders. And I think Minnesotans, and I think many American citizens in many different states, came to appreciate just how real those executive orders can be. I mean, the ability to lock down schools, lock down businesses, lock nursing home patients into a facility that's infested with active viral disease and not have any, if you will, public discussion about it. This is huge. So the governor impacts in a lot of ways in that regard. In Minnesota, the governor oftentimes leads on the spending packages. So how are the dollars going to be spent? I think the governor obviously has the veto power, and that will help that person shape, again, the social contract and also the rule of law in that particular state. And then I think it's important not to forget that the governor has a bully pulpit that can be used in a variety of ways, some insidious and some very honorably. I think in Minneapolis, in terms of upcoming elections, we've got the situation with a mayor being elected, and we have several opponents to the incumbent. But what's fascinating about the coming election is that the single word terms that are used to describe the candidate, whether you're saying Republican or Democrat or socialist or whatever, these are not necessarily agreed upon. And so we have a situation where there's some confusion. And then you throw into the mix that they're utilizing ranked choice voting, which will potentially allow ramifications that people who advocated for ranked choice voting may not have recognized. I mean, we're seeing coalitions of candidates against another candidate take place in an effort to, on the second consideration of the ballot or the third consideration of the ballot. And these are things that
game theory.
It is absolutely game theory. But getting back to Minnesota, I think Minnesota represents at some level a little bit of a pilot project for a lot of states. Clearly, we've been out of bounds in many ways over the last 5-6 years. Our rights were infringed upon in ways that many citizens in other states did not have to endure. And what I think my challenge is in running for governor is, how do I prevent Minnesotans from suffering from memory loss? Because I think it's so easy to forget what we went through. And I think what we talked about before, Randy, is really important. And that is informed consent. I think that at some level, informed consent does almost summarize so much of what happened that was bad over the last 5-6 years. Specifically, informed consent has given physicians and hospitals far too much power over the everyday patient. The patient may feel marginalized, may feel like a pawn in a chess game. Patients are being dismissed from doctors' offices because they didn't quietly go along with what they were told to do. I think where we stand today is we are at an inflection point that could allow medicine for everyday folks to get a lot better than it has been. We just didn't see it coming. We have had a hierarchy of who makes the decisions in medicine. Physician, administrator, hospital, insurance, thank you. But maybe down here, patient. I think we have the potential to see a renaissance for the patient. And I really believe that will be one of the best things, because with internet and artificial intelligence, I think patients are so equipped to get smart on a topic. I know physicians bristle at that and they say they didn't go to medical school. Well, you know what? Medical school has changed. From when you and I went, Dr. Bach, it's a lot different. Today, medical school has an awful lot to do with how do you and how quickly can you access information to put together what needs to be put together in order to treat a patient. Back in the day, we'd memorize it. We'd go to grand rounds. We'd duke it out over who was right on the diagnosis, who was right on the therapeutic plan. Today, I think that when a patient encounters a physician who resents that the patient has already done some homework, if I were that patient, I'd go find another doctor. because I think you should be thanked for doing your homework. There should be a conversation, a candid conversation. And then ultimately, through the shared decision-making model, the physician should be looking at the patient and saying, it sounds like we've got 3 possibilities here. 1, 2, or 3. What would you like to do? And then the physician can weigh in as well. But I think that I see a brighter day tomorrow than yesterday. And I'm not frightened about tomorrow at all. I would have been frightened about tomorrow 3 or 4 years ago, but we're past that.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about it, because if we do, then we can repeat it.
So let me ask you something that is pertinent to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Minneapolis had literally a trial by fire. And the Summer of Love, the George Floyd summer of 2020. And this is kind of, it dovetails with the talk about COVID and all that kind of stuff. Everyone was locked down, but this is somehow therapeutic to have riots. You couldn't have the Sturgis motorcycle rally, 80,000 people. That was like, oh my God, that's terrible. But to have, double that or whatever, all throughout the country, people rioting in close quarters, that was somehow part of public health. But the trial by fire that Minneapolis, I haven't been there in decades, but I don't know how much was burnt out. I don't know. I mean, we saw pictures and, it was a mostly peaceful protests and all that kind of stuff, but there seemed to be, huge damage and so forth. How is Minnesota recovering? And how do you prevent kind of the amnesia or the recasting of this information as something that would get, say, Tim Walz reelected? And you've had experience. You've debated him, one-on-one. I'm not sure how many times, at least once in the 2022 election. What's the pathway? What's the thing? What are the things, kind of in a non-medical way? We're going to analogize your medical concepts, and I think they're very stalwart and reasonable and moral and correct. So how do we analogize those towards the fight? You're going to have a Republican primary, and then presuming you win, you have a general election. How does that play out? What are the things that you have now that you didn't have then, which was also post, the riots and whatnot? Tim Walz won. What's changed in the landscape? What are the ways of kind of bringing, I guess, a different perspective to Minnesota? Does Minnesota want it, and can they get it, and how would they get it through you?
It's a big question. I think that I would say this. Anytime someone loses, whether it's a game of tiddlywinks, a softball game, a golf match, a competition, if you lose, you examine what you did frequently ad nauseum. You just can't let it go. If you win, there's sort of a warm afterglow that lasts for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you move on. I think millions of Minnesotans, as well as myself, have gone through the soul searching. What's most important? What happened? Looking back on the last 5, 6 years, how do we go forward? And I think that's the big change. I think the everyday Minnesotan is saying, listen, I want my public servant leaders that we elect to focus on the issues that I talk about in my home with my family at the kitchen table. And I want an economy that allows me to pay the bills and dream dreams and achieve them. I want safety in my neighborhood and in my community so that my children can go out and play without having to worry about a drive-by shooting. I want my children to get an education that's focused on the basics that'll allow them to dream dreams and go out and achieve them. I don't want my children being indoctrinated, and I don't want to hear that. But if I choose to go to a school board meeting and learn about it, I don't want anyone calling me names or calling me a terrorist because I went to a school board meeting. This is my family, and I'm in charge of my family. Mama bears and Papa bears are saying that across the nation. Those are the things we're going to talk about more than ever, and I think that the current governor is at risk for. But I think there's another thing, and I think that is, what does good government look like? Because I think people are hungry for good government. And in Minnesota, we've become the poster child for fraud. I mean, it doesn't matter if the program is dealing with feeding our future for kids, whether it's to provide support for people with disabilities, the homeless, seniors, daycare, kids with autism. Virtually every initiative that seems to be going through human services and some through the Department of Education, there's been fraud involved. And the current administration has been extremely slow in reacting to it. And when there is a reaction, it appears to be politically motivated. So having said that, I think Minnesotans are sick and tired of the fraud because they know in their hearts that when someone frauds someone or something, they're stealing. Well, if in North Minneapolis or in South St. Paul, we could have taken that $1 to $2 billion of stolen money and put it to work, creating safe neighborhoods, enterprise zones that work and were sustainable, we could have changed the world. But instead, Minneapolis and St. Paul are both arguably cities in distress. And I think most people would say that. So this time around, I'm absolutely aware and appreciative and on board with the fact that many Minnesotans are saying, one, we want accountability because that's the only way we're going to have an affordable cost of living. Two, we want competence to replace the chaos that our current governor is bathing in. But we also want to recognize that compassion is important. If people find themselves down and out, we want some kind of a safety net to help them out, not as a destination place, but as an opportunity or a ladder so that they can climb out of that situation, dream dreams, get back to work and achieve those dreams. But I think a lot of folks are recognizing that there's a place for public policy, but people are passionate that when it comes to personal privacy, I think there's a strong recognition that people say, please stay out of my home, stay out of my bedroom, stay out of my doctor's office, stay out of my church. Government is to be limited. And I am committed, Randy, to running based on less government, limited taxes, a lower cost of living, and send a message to government and just say, leave me alone and let me live my life as much as is possible, as long as I'm not doing something that prevents someone else from having the same privilege. That's what we're going to be doing this time around.
Excellent. So I really appreciate your time. We could kind of wrap it up here, but I had one little side question. When you go to at least a lot of neighborhoods in Japan, universally, you go in the restaurant, they have the dishes, these little mock-up of the dishes, so you can see what it is you're going to order. I don't know if you've seen that at certain restaurants. So they have, they might have a picture of the spaghetti, whatever, so you can see what it is. So if people were going to get in the voting booth and vote for you, there are governors out extant right now, probably 50 of them. Do you template or model yourself after any particular governor? It can be current or previous. And you mentioned Ronald Reagan before. He obviously governed the United States before he was governor of California. Are there kind of templates by which you can see the standard of what good governance is, good governing or good governoring as a governor? And does Tim Walz, what kind of template does he fall in? And how does your template differ from that? And what are the states like that have better governorship?
I think you're asking me to define good governance in terms of how I would try to govern. And you're asking me to comment on Tim Walz. I'll make it brief about Tim. I think Tim is an ambitious politician. And I think that he's become very skilled at doing those conventional, traditional things that politicians do. In terms of answering a question, he can talk for 2 or 3 minutes and provide a pretty good-looking word salad. And when he's done, you say, that sounded good, but what did he say? So I would just leave it at that. I think Tim is a polished politician and ambitious. Myself, I would probably take, if you will, a composite of 3 people. One would be Abraham Lincoln, because I do think at the end of the day, Lincoln was an emancipator. And if you look at what our country has gone through, there's no question minorities have suffered far longer than they should have. I'm grateful to Abraham Lincoln. But women by the population aren't a minority, but they were treated as such. It took our country 150 years to grant the right to vote to women. This was horribly wrong. It wasn't until 1972 in Title IX that women could know that they could compete in sports. And I am going to stand strongly for fairness and privacy for women in the locker room, the bathroom, and on the field of competition. This to me just seems sensible. And that came way late. And I think that some of the things that Lincoln did combined with some of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did, combined with some of the things that Ronald Reagan stood for, is what we need to do. And so when I think of Lincoln as an emancipator, and I think of Teddy Roosevelt saying, everybody has to be treated fairly under the law. Nobody gets a free pass to go around, go collect $200 and not go to jail. Teddy Roosevelt spoke it clear. And on top of that, he was one of the few people that had the vision to see what we can do when it comes to protecting our natural resources. And then you land on Reagan. And Dr. Bach, when I think of Reagan, I think of someone who was unabashedly supportive of faith and family and freedom. He loved the works of the founding fathers. He absolutely saw the need to honor life, to have limited government, to have less taxes. I think he recognized the need to celebrate exceptionalism wherever you see it. Doesn't matter if it's in Japan or in the United States, Argentina or Zimbabwe. Doesn't matter. If you see excellence, salute it. And I think that individual rights have to be sacrosanct. Individual rights are what gave birth to our country. And I think Reagan had it right. Communism is a failed experiment. It does not work with human characteristics and the way we're wired. And I think he said pretty clearly, if you want peace, do it through strength, not by begging. And at the end of the day, I think he challenged our cities to be the bright, shining city on a hill, but I think he challenged each of us to try to be the best version of ourselves we can be. Today, I hope I'm a better version of me than I was yesterday. And tomorrow, I hope I do better than today.
Well, you have my vote. Thank you so much, Dr. Jensen.
Thank you.